Hey, good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for tuning in. This is Kyle Broda from Full Skills Exam Prep, and we're really excited because we have a great lesson for you today. So we're going to talk about residency requirements. Now, I know you talked about this in the course that you took, but we're going to help you to transfer your knowledge of that into an exam context. So I know for most of you, you probably think this is a pretty easy topic. You know, it's 2 out of 5 years. But there's a couple tricky little areas that we're going to cover in this lesson, and by understanding this topic as a whole, as it pertains to your ICCRC Full Skills Exam, you're going to be able to tackle 1, 2, hopefully 3 questions on your exam, and you'll hit a home run with those. All right, so thank you for tuning in. I'm really looking forward to working through the lesson with you and bringing you a few steps closer to passing the Full Skills Exam. So we're really happy you made some time to work through this lesson. As I said before, we're really going to take you a couple steps closer to passing the Full Skills Exam because this is an incredibly important topic. Now, I know a lot of you are probably working through the IRCC manuals and you're going through IRPA and the regulations and your notes from school and everything else. And it's probably a little bit difficult for you to prioritize exactly what to study. That's exactly what we're here for. We're here to help you make the transition from graduating from your course to passing the Full Skills Exam as easy as possible. So you're going to work through the video, you're going to work through the sample questions, the court cases, and if you want to really read a little bit more about this topic, Enforcement 23 is the best manual to help you to understand just about everything you need to know really about residency requirements. By going through the video today, of course, we're going to really help you have a better understanding of that topic. And you'll notice that as you work through manuals available on the IRCC website, you've probably noticed that a lot of them contain the same information, or parts of each one really contain some information that was available in the other manual. Now, Enforcement 23 is the perfect manual really for you to understand this topic thoroughly. OP10 discusses this as well, but if you only have time to read one, go for Enforcement 23. Remember, of course, IRPA and the regulations. That should be the building blocks of your education in terms of preparing for the Full Skills Exam. Now, what we do with these videos and with the simulations and everything is we help you to transition that immigration knowledge into an exam context. But the immigration knowledge that you've obtained in this topic should be based on these articles, these regulations, and these manuals available to you. Okay, remember that with just about every single topic, the IRCC website is also a really great supplementary resource. So they have a Help Center question about residency requirements. And if you want to work through that, it's a really great tool for you as well. Okay, of course, the court cases that are linked at the bottom of the lesson here, if you're watching it on the fullskillsexamprep.com website, those really help you to take all of this information and see it in the context of real-life cases. And of course, the simulation questions available right after this are there to help you, again, transition your immigration knowledge into an exam situation. Now, one of my favorite things about this topic in terms of preparing you for your Full Skills Exam is that by really understanding residency requirements as it plays a role in your Full Skills Exam, it gives you the ability to really understand a piece of every single immigration option. Residency requirements have to be met by every single permanent resident. Now, this doesn't matter if a person is a millionaire investor or a billionaire investor who's immigrating to Canada. Even Bill Gates or someone like that would have to meet the residency requirements in order to keep his or her permanent resident status. Let's say the person maybe doesn't have any money. Maybe the person is a refugee claimant or someone who is transitioning from being a student to post-grad work permit to immigrating under the Canadian Experience class. Well, even after immigration, that person as well would have to meet his or her residency requirement. And just to bring home this point, it doesn't make a difference if the person immigrates under one of the federal programs. So let's say the person immigrates under the Federal Skilled Worker Program through Express Entry. Well, that person still would have to meet his or her residency requirements, even if he can live wherever he wants in Canada, of course outside of Quebec. Let's say a person immigrates under one of the Quebec immigration programs. So we know that Quebec is a little bit different in immigration. Well, the residency requirements are the exact same because that's under the federal government. And the person would have to meet the residency requirements just like every other permanent resident. Same thing if the person is immigrating under a provincial nominee program. So here I have the flag for British Columbia, but it'd be the exact same if the person was immigrating under the, let's say PEI, PNP, or anything like that. The person would still have to meet his or her residency requirements after being in Canada, of course. Now, a very important piece of the puzzle for you to remember is that residency requirements do not pertain to Canadian citizens. All right, so if a person obtains citizenship and then goes to work in, let's say, China or Brazil or any other country, he or she would still be a citizen. It doesn't matter if the person leaves for 20 years. That person would still be a citizen and does not have to meet residency requirements. So that's one of the big differences between permanent residents and Canadian citizens is the residency requirements. Now, in order for us to understand how residency requirements can play a role in your full skills exam, let's go step by step like we usually do. I know in your course your teachers covered this topic thoroughly, and you probably remember that it's 2 out of 5 years. It's not that simple. So we're going to break this down and go step by step. Remember that what we do as well in terms of prepare you for your exam is to help you take a look at all the little exceptions, take a look at all the little tricky areas of the topic as it might play a role in your exam, and help you overcome that. So if you see any of those tricky little areas in your exam, you'll know because we're going to talk about them, and you'll know how to answer that question. So as a first step, we're going to split this down into 2 general areas. We'll talk about the time requirements with regards to residency, and of course, what exactly is meant by residency, and if there are any exceptions to the person being in Canada. So we're going to cover all these little topics here, and this is going to clarify this for you in terms of seeing this topic through the scope of what to prepare for your upcoming ICCRC Full Skills Exam. Now let's begin this by exploring the time requirements for permanent residents. Now, when we take a look at Article 28, and I'm sure this is one of the first articles you took a look at when you began your immigration practitioner course, well, it starts off pretty simple. So we can see that there is a 5-year period during which a permanent resident has to comply with their residency obligations. So we know that there is a 5-year period as the base of what we need to know in order to understand this topic. Well, as we explore Article 28 a little bit deeper, we can see that it gives us a second time period. Now that time period is 730 days. So in the 5 years, the permanent resident has to meet the residency requirement for 730 days. and that adds up to 2 years. The next question, of course, we need to ask is what is meant by this residency requirement? So what does the person actually have to do in those 5 years? Well, the easiest one is to understand that the person has to be physically present in Canada. The trickier ones are over here as we explore Article 28 a little bit deeper. So there are exceptions to being in Canada, and those are some of the tricky areas that we're going to take a look at in the next section over here. But we're going to continue with our lesson on the time obligations before moving into some of those exceptions. All right, so we've seen that the permanent resident has to meet these residency requirements for 2 years out of every 5. One of the first questions we need to really address is to understand when this time period begins. And essentially it's when the permanent resident arrives in Canada. So it's not when he applies, it's not when he pays his right of permanent residence fee or anything like that. It's when the person arrives in Canada in order to activate his permanent resident status. So that is the starting period. Now the ending period is every 5 years, but there's a tricky little piece in there that we're going to explore in the next slide. So let's begin with a little tip for you. Now, when we're looking at residency requirements as they pertain to time, you need to start thinking of the 5 years on a sliding scale. So don't trick yourself by thinking that the clock resets every 5 years, because it doesn't. I'm going to give you an example here just to really bring this idea home for you. All right, so let's say a person immigrates in 2016. So he spends 2 years in Canada at that point, and it's great. He should be happy because he has met his residency requirements all the way until the end of 2020. Okay, so he's met his residency requirements for those 5 years. Now, the tricky part is here. The person still has to meet his residency requirements for the years 2018 all the way through to 2022, and that's inclusive. All right, so if the person thinks that the clock resets at 2020, then he would be in violation of his residency requirements. All right, so that's one tip for you. And if you ever see anything in your exam dealing with this type of thing, where maybe they have a question where the person wants to return in 2022, he would be in violation of his residency requirements because he wouldn't have been in the country from 2018 all the way to 2022. So that's a gap where he's missing 2 years. And just to reiterate the point we were making in the previous slide, remember the 5 years do not get reset every 5 years. So let's say, for example, somebody immigrates in 2015. So we'll just say January 1st, 2015 to keep it simple. And he would have to meet his residency requirements, of course, for 2015 all the way to 2019. But remember, you don't want to think of this as a clock resetting, because you might get a situation like this where the person came to Canada for 2 years, from 2015 to the end of 2016. So yes, he met his residency requirements for those 5 years. Now let's say the person wants to come back to Canada in 2022 all the way to the end of 2023. And then he wants to come back in 2027 all the way to the end of 2028. Well, he would be missing a gap of residency. Okay, so this person would not meet his or her residency requirements from 2017 all the way to 2021 because the person, if the person is planning to do this, he or she would not be in Canada for those 5 years. Okay, so this is an interesting little trick that you can use because it'll help you to understand time as it relates to immigration obligations. Okay, let's dig into procedures a little bit here. Now, remember that permanent residents have to meet a residency requirement, as we just saw. Now, that residency requirement has to be met within every 5-year period. All right, so when a permanent resident shows up at the point of entry, they have to be able to demonstrate certain things to the officer. Now, what they demonstrate will lead to the officer either admitting them to Canada or not admitting them to Canada and issuing a removal order. Now, one of the options is that the permanent resident, if that person has been a permanent resident for less than 5 years, they have to prove that they will be able to meet that residency obligation. Okay, so if a permanent resident shows up at the border, and let's say he or she has been a permanent resident for 1 year but only spent 1 week in Canada, that person still has 4 years to meet the residency requirements. So the officer would likely admit that person into Canada. All right, so what he's thinking over here, as we can see in his thought bubble, is he's asking himself if there is time for the PR to meet those residency requirements if he or she is allowed entry. Now, the second option is for people, for permanent residents who have been permanent residents for a longer time. And that is, of course, the officer asking himself, has this permanent resident already met his or her residency requirements? If the answer is yes, then he'll smile and say, hey, welcome home. If the answer is no, there is a removal order. All right, we're going to talk about the removal order procedures a little bit more later on in the video as well. All right, let's take all of this information we've been talking about and put it into an example. So your example is over here. Now here we have Patrick, and Patrick is an Irish citizen who arrived in Canada as a Quebec skilled worker on January 1st, 2015, and he left Canada on January 1st, 2017. So remember what we talked about before, where even if a person immigrates to Quebec, he or she still has to meet those residency requirements just like anybody else. Now, in your mind, what you should start doing when you have something like this in a question is you should be picturing sort of a timeline like this. Now, we know that he spent 2 years here in Canada. And so we can add this to our timeline. When we take a look at the second part of this little example here, we could see how we can help him as an RCIC. So we could see that it says he calls you because he would like to know when he must return to Canada by in order to not be in violation of his residency requirements. All right, so now with this part over here, what we're doing is, in our mind, we're taking a look at the 5-year sliding scale. So we can see that from January 1st, 2015, all the way to January 1st, 2020, he's met his requirements. But we need to take a look at the next 5-year gap. And that would be from 2017 all the way through to 2021. All right, so in here, by understanding this, we know that he has to return to Canada at the latest, and of course you wouldn't recommend him to do this at the latest because if there's a flight delay or something like that, he might not even be allowed entry into Canada. But anyways, he must return to Canada by January 1st, 2020 so that he can meet the 2-year requirement out of every 5 years before the next gap. And that next gap is 2017 to 2021. Alright, so that first one was a pretty straightforward example. Let's take a look at another example to explore again how time related to residency requirements can play a role in your ICCRC Full Skills Exam. So this second example deals with Jose. Now Jose is an engineer from Nicaragua who has been living in Canada since he obtained his residency on November 17th, 2015. Alright, so right away I hope you're getting sort of a timeline in your head. So you should look something like this. Okay, so we don't really know, in terms of the scenario, we don't really know how long he's been in Canada, but the second part gives us a little hint over here. Starting in December 2016, he'd like to go back to Nicaragua every 2 years at a time, because he is going to be semi-retired next year. Alright, so in our mind, we could see that November 17th, 2015 to December 2016, we can approximate it and just say it's a year. Okay, then he wants to go back to Nicaragua for 2 years at a time. Alright. Would this plan contravene his residency requirements? So for you, what you need to start thinking of is if he does this plan. Let's say he goes to Nicaragua for 2 years, then back to Canada for 1 year. Then back to Nicaragua for 2 years, then back to Canada for 1 year, etc. Would he be in violation of his residency requirements? And hopefully you can see that yes, he would be in violation of this because while he meets the requirements for year 1 through year 5, for year 2 through year 6, he would not, because he would only have 1 year in Canada at that point, when, remember, he has to have 2 years in Canada at that point. All right, let's dig into Jose's example a little bit more so that we can, again, round out our understanding of this topic. So if you remember from the chart, you could probably deduce that if Jose stays 2 extra years in Canada, his plan can work. Now the question is, which years must he stay? Alright, so you're probably doing the math. I'll give you a few seconds here. I'll give you 30 seconds so that you can try to add together which of the 2 years he must stay in order to not be in violation of his residency requirements. Okay, so hopefully you've figured it out. And hopefully you're taking what we talked about before, that idea of using sort of a sliding scale to see if a person meets the residency requirements in terms of time. And that means, of course, the 2 years out of 5. Now for Jose, he can actually add an extra year into pretty much anywhere. in the gap over here. So if he stayed 1 extra year in year 2, 3, 5, or 6, he would meet his residency requirements. But of course, he would also have to stay an extra year somewhere in year 8, 9, 11, and 12. Alright, so we've completed the time requirements as it relates to residency requirements. Let's take a look now at what the person actually has to do within the time period that we specified. So remember, the time period that we specified is 2 years out of every 5. We learned how to measure all of that time, and we learned some little tricks that we can use in an exam, in the full skills exam, so that we can answer these questions quickly, concisely, and move on. Now, you have a good understanding of half of the equation that we need to know. The other half is here in residency. So what exactly is meant by residency? And what are the exceptions to a person being physically present in Canada? Alright, so let's jump in and take a look at the residency obligations now that we've conquered time requirements in these obligations. So we know that in Article 28 there is a very concise, very direct description of how time relates to this residency obligation. So we talked about that 5-year time period and the fact that the permanent resident needs to meet those residency obligations for at least 2 years in every 5-year period. And remember, that's a sliding scale. Now, the part that we're going to really explore here is exactly what's meant by the residency obligation. So essentially, what does the person have to do during those 2 years out of every 5? Alright, so we can see the easy one is being physically present in Canada, but there's a lot of other little areas for us to explore over here. And remember, these form those exceptions that play a large role in your exam. So the first one's pretty easy. The first one is essentially that the person has to be physically present in Canada as a permanent resident. While this person is in Canada, he or she can do pretty much anything. If the person's working, that counts. If the person's studying, that counts. Even if the person maybe is unemployed, hey, it still counts towards his or her residency requirements. Maybe the person is taking a cross-Canada tour. So maybe he or she is driving all the way across Canada, and it'll take this person 3 months, 6 months. It still counts as being physically present in Canada. Alright, so the first option over here is, I think it's kind of the easier one. The only tricky part that maybe can play a role in your exam is if the person's in Canada, but studying, maybe not working or traveling, or in Quebec or in Nunavut. It all counts towards meeting those residency requirements. So the first exception to being physically present in Canada that we're going to take a look at is this one. So in Article 28, as we dig a little bit deeper into it, we saw that a person has to be physically present in Canada. However, if a person is outside Canada but accompanying their Canadian citizen, spouse, common law partner, or parent, then this time would count towards their residency requirement. All right, one of the tricky little pieces to look at with this has to do with the definition of a child in this case. Now, if you've worked through the family class lessons that are available on the website, then this is going to be a little bit easier for you. And I think this shows you how interlocking all these lessons really are. But for a child, remember, this has to be a dependent child. Okay, this dependent child has to ordinarily reside with the parent who is a Canadian citizen. And one little interesting piece that you can see in Enforcement Manual 23 is that the child cannot have been ever married or in a common law relationship. Now, in terms of understanding the relationship needed for someone to be considered a spouse or common law partner, we analyzed this pretty thoroughly in the spouse, common law, conjugal partner lesson. So if you've gone through that, this subsection of Article 28 will be a little bit easier for you. Let's take a look at this concept through a very common scenario that is designed to test your knowledge on this topic here. So here we have Frank, all right? Frank is a Canadian citizen. Now, he sponsored his wife and her dependent children to move to Canada. So right away, you might think that this is a family class question, and in some ways it is. But just as I said right at the beginning of the lesson, the notion of residency requirements is one of the best areas that you can study for your full skills exam, just because it goes across the entire spectrum of immigration. All right, so by understanding residency requirements, you'd be able to understand this question here. Okay, so let's continue on with this now. Frank is a Canadian citizen. He sponsored his wife and her dependent children to move to Canada. A year after their arrival, the family decides to move to France for the next 4 years. Now, in your mind, you need to start thinking of whether or not they would be in violation of their residency requirements. Because if they're moving away for 4 years, obviously they're not going to meet that requirement of being in Canada for 2 years out of 5. So what we need to really think about in here is if they qualify for one of those exceptions to being in Canada. All right, and we can see that Frank is a Canadian citizen. Now, due to the fact that he sponsored his wife and those dependent children to move to Canada, we can assume that they are all permanent residents, which would mean that, yes, if they're accompanying Frank, they would likely meet their residency requirements because of the article that we're looking at right now. Okay, I'm going to give you a study tip over here as well. One of the tricky little parts of a scenario like Frank's here is that, remember, the spouse or common law partner or dependent child, they have to be a permanent resident. It's not somebody who Frank maybe met while working in France and then they lived there for a lot of years. They wouldn't need to meet their residency requirements because they wouldn't be permanent residents. Remember that for Frank, in this case, to sponsor his wife or dependent children, that permanent resident status would have to be activated in Canada, and of course while Frank is in Canada as well. Okay, let's take a look at one of those other exceptions to being physically present in Canada. So when we take a look a little bit deeper into Article 28, we could see that if a person is outside Canada and is accompanying a permanent resident, so remember in the last example we saw somebody accompanying a citizen. Now it's the same idea for the middle section of this, where the person has to be accompanying their spouse or common law partner or parent, but there's an extra section here, and now that is the employment part. So the person has to be employed on a full-time basis by a Canadian business or in the federal public administration or the public service of a province. Now, let's take a look at an example again in a scenario that you should be preparing for your full skills exam. So we have Frank again. Now, this time Frank is a permanent resident and not a citizen. All right, and the rest of it is the exact same. So he sponsored his wife and her dependent children. 1 year after arrival in Canada, they want to move to France for 4 years. So you need to ask yourself if the group would be in violation of their residency requirements if they pursued this plan. And the answer is they would be in violation of their residency requirements because they will not have met their 2 years out of 5. Okay, so now we can understand that in terms of time, but we need to take a look at what's missing. So what could this group do, or what could Frank do in order for the family not to miss out on their residency requirements? And the solution is in the second half of that article there, where we can see that Frank would have to be employed on a full-time basis by a Canadian business or in the federal public administration or in the public service of a province. Now, I know this sounds a little bit complicated. Don't worry, we've got you covered. We're going to go through exactly what is needed in terms of the employment and in terms of the business as well in the next little section here to help clarify that for you. Okay, so we just talked about the accompanying family members of a permanent resident. So remember that the permanent resident himself or herself has to abide by this regulation here, which means that the permanent resident has to be outside Canada, but employed on a full-time basis by a Canadian business or in the federal public administration or the public service of a province. Now let's break down this one so that we can really understand what they're talking about here, and so that we can see it in terms of a scenario that might pop up on your exam. All right, so we're going to split this down into 2 pieces here. Now the first piece that we're going to analyze is what is meant by a Canadian business or in the federal public administration or the public service of a province. So we're going to call that the organization requirements. Now the second piece that we need to understand is exactly what's meant by employed on a full-time basis. So we're going to analyze the employment requirements needed in order to satisfy this article as well. So when we take a look at what exactly is meant by being employed by either the Canadian government or a business, we can see that in terms of the organization itself, there are a few requirements. So one of those requirements is that the company needs to be incorporated at a federal level or provincial level, and of course has to have ongoing operations in Canada. Okay, if the company is not an incorporated business, that's okay. The enterprise, though, needs to have, that's in addition, of course, to the incorporated business, they need to have the ability to generate revenue. The company has to be made to generate a profit. So that would omit non-profits and that kind of thing. And of course, the company has to be Canadian owned. So that means that the majority of the ownership or voting interests are held by Canadian citizens, permanent residents, or Canadian businesses. All right, so crown corporations are included in this. And one big issue here that we can see in Regulation 61 is that a person cannot start a business primarily to allow him or her to circumvent the regulations on residency. So the person needs to, of course, work for a genuine company. He can't start a company and then go overseas and just say he's an employee of that company. It has to be a real company in order for the person to still meet his or her residency requirements overseas according to this regulation. All right, so let's take a look at the employment requirements in terms of the employee himself. All right, so we could see again in Article 28, the person needs to be employed on a full-time basis. Now, we took a look at what is meant by a Canadian business or the federal public administration or the public service of a province. So we know what type of company the person has to work for, but what we need to find out now is what type of work the person needs to do. All right, so let's take a look at the employment requirements for that employee, because a person can work for one of these companies, but if the employment requirements do not meet the requirements set out by IRPA and the regulations, then the person would still not meet his or her residency requirements. Okay, so the person needs to, of course, be under contract full-time to a Canadian business. All right, that business needs to be controlled from Canada. All right, so that's the biggest point to begin with, is that the person and the work they're doing needs to be controlled from Canada. All right, they need to be on a full-time basis, of course, as well. And this is one of the interesting ones here, is that they need to be outside Canada in a position with one of those Canadian companies or Canadian-based companies. But if you take a look at the last little section of this point here, we also have an affiliated enterprise or a client. Now, one of the cases you're going to read just at the bottom of this lesson, and that case is named OBRA, deals with exactly this. Okay, they need to maintain connection to that Canadian business. Now that is essential. The work needs to be on a temporary basis. We have a question in one of the simulations dealing with this point, and people email all the time to ask about it. And yes, the work that people do outside Canada, if they're using the fact that they're working for a business outside of Canada as part of their as part of the requirements to not be in Canada to meet their residency requirements, remember that that work outside Canada needs to be on a temporary basis. Okay, the fact that the work is temporary and the fact that the person is working for a Canadian company means that the person will continue with this work with the employer in Canada after this temporary assignment is finished. Now, temporary in this case can mean a couple of years, maybe even a couple of months. All right, but the person needs to continue to work in Canada, or intend to anyways, with the employer that sent them overseas. Now, just to go back and conclude the example we saw with Frank. Now, remember that when Frank, with the first example we saw, when Frank was a Canadian citizen, essentially they just had to prove the relationship requirements for the family to still meet their permanent resident residency obligations while accompanying Frank overseas. However, for Frank, as a permanent resident, remember that he needs to meet those employment requirements in order for the residency requirements to be met while he's living overseas. And that goes for the family as well. Now, with those employment requirements, remember we just talked about exactly what needs to be done over there. So the temporariness of the contract, of course, full-time basis, etc. Remember that the employment is one thing, but he would also have to have those employment requirements with a company that meets those organizational requirements. All right, so I hope that clears up that whole area for you. So for a person who is accompanying him, such as the wife and dependent children who are all permanent residents, they would be able to meet their residency requirements by accompanying Frank, assuming that Frank, as a permanent resident and not a citizen, meets those employment requirements. And that those employment requirements, of course, meet the organization requirements. Okay, let's jump back into procedures a little bit more here. So when a person arrives at the point of entry, let's take a look at what happens and how this relates to those residency requirements. So we have, of course, the visa officer and the permanent resident. Now you can see that the permanent resident is looking a little bit nervous, and that's because maybe he didn't meet his residency requirements. So the first thing that the officer does, of course, is confirm the permanent resident status of this person. All right, the next thing in here is that he or she will assess if the permanent residency obligations, so those 2 years out of 5, if they've been met already, or if they can be met. So we talked about this right at the beginning of the lesson. Now, of course, you have two options, and that is yes and no. If the residency obligations have been met already, perfect, he'll say welcome home. And if the residency obligations can be met, he will also allow entry into Canada. But the tricky part is when we get here. So what if the permanent resident has not met his or her residency obligations or cannot meet those residency obligations? One of the other things that the officer will look for at that point is whether or not there are H&C factors, so humanitarian and compassionate reasons, that would explain why the person did not meet or cannot meet his or her residency obligations. Now, if there are H&C factors there, then the person would be allowed entry into Canada. If there are not H&C factors at that point, the officer will take a look at this and he will verify whether or not the permanent resident can relinquish his or her permanent resident status rather than issuing an inadmissibility report. Now, with this, there's a couple tricky little areas in whether or not the officer will allow someone to relinquish their PR status. So he can only do this if the person has made it clear that he or she wishes to enter Canada temporarily, so not retain their permanent resident status. So with this one here, the officer can inform the person at that point that he or she can relinquish status because the person does not intend to make Canada his or her permanent home. All right, if the officer allows the person entry into Canada because the person says that he or she wants to voluntarily relinquish their PR status, and this is of course without prompting from the officer can't suggest this unless the permanent resident mentions that he only wants to go to Canada just temporarily for this trip. Okay, then if the person relinquishes that status, then that occurs within about 30 days. If the person rescinds that relinquishment, so if the person says he's going to relinquish his or her PR status and enters Canada, and then 2 weeks later says, you know what, I'm not going to give up my PR status, I love it here. It'll probably be summertime. And anyways, the time that this person spends in Canada does not count towards the PR status, of course, and the removal order would be issued at that point. All right, if the person cannot relinquish his status or doesn't mention it or anything like that, then an inadmissibility report would be filed under Article 44. And that would be one of those inadmissibility clauses, which would be non-compliance of the residency requirements. Now at this point, same thing, the person does not necessarily lose their permanent resident status at that point, because under Article 46, remember that the loss of status for a permanent resident would happen when the person becomes a citizen, which of course would not be the case in this one. Okay, when there is a final determination, which is what we would exactly look for in this one here. Okay, or refugee, the refugee claim has been vacated, etc. This wouldn't be the case really in the example we're looking at here, or if the person relinquishes his or her status. So the final determination would be the one that we're looking at, and that would be, of course, at the end of the appeals. We'll take a look at this in the next slide over here. So let's continue on with exploring the procedures of what happens after that inadmissibility report is filed. All right, so remember at that point, the permanent resident, and he is still a permanent resident at that point, has the option of filing an appeal. Now, I'm going to ask you if you know where he would file an appeal to. You can take a look in your test day data book if you want. And if you don't want to, you're just listening and enjoying the lesson, no problem. It goes to the IAD. Remember, there's a difference in the timeline for a person who is inside of Canada versus outside of Canada. And if the person is outside of Canada, the appeal period for them is 60 days. If the person is in Canada, that appeal period is 30 days. Now, as you know, with an appeal, there's really two outcomes. One would be that the person appeals successfully and he remains a permanent resident. Now, the other option would be, of course, an unsuccessful appeal, or if the person just decides to not appeal at all, then he or she would lose permanent resident status at that point. So if the person doesn't appeal, then at the end of the appeal period, which is 60 days, he or she would lose permanent resident status. And if the person does appeal, and the appeal takes whatever amount of days that it takes, and the appeal is unsuccessful, the person loses his or her permanent resident status at that point, because at that point, it's the final determination, as we saw in the previous slide when we looked at Article 46. Now, as a final point in this lesson, let's just talk about PR cards for a minute here. This plays an important role, of course, again, just because it plays a role in pretty much every immigration program. A permanent resident, of course, needs a PR card. All right, so remember that a PR card shows the officers at the border that the person has status. Now, a permanent resident, of course, has the authority to enter Canada. These cards are only issued in Canada. So if a person wants to obtain his or her PR card outside of Canada, they can't. For many of you, you probably came to Canada as permanent residents yourself, so you probably know this. For some other people, it might be one of your first experiences with really looking behind the scenes of PR cards. So remember that PR cards have a 5-year validity, but there is an exception. Now, if a permanent resident is waiting for the finalization of an appeal or an admissibility hearing or a report, then the IRCC and the government can't really leave this person without identification. So the person would receive a new PR card, but this PR card would have only a 1-year validity. If a person shows up to the border and does not have a PR card for the officers, they would assume that the person does not have PR status. Remember that, of course, people have to be able to properly identify themselves at the border, and they would have to be able to convince the officer that they have permanent resident status. So this doesn't mean that the officer wouldn't let the person in, but the person would have to be able to prove that they do have permanent resident status, even though they don't have the card. And remember, the onus in everything always relies on the applicant or the permanent resident in this case. As a final point, it's important for us to take a look at what happens when PR cards are revoked. So this whole lesson we've been talking about people who could potentially lose their PR status due to not meeting the residency requirements. Well, if a person loses their status, the PR card gets revoked. But there are a few other situations during which a permanent resident card would be revoked. Now, if the person becomes a Canadian citizen, of course, at that point, they would likely get a citizenship certificate or a passport, and they would have that card revoked, the permanent resident card. If a final determination has been made, that means that the person is no longer a permanent resident, so the PR card for them would be revoked as well. When a person is subject to a removal order, and that removal order comes into force, the PR card gets revoked. And if a person has claimed protected person status, and the IRB has vacated that person's status, the PR card gets revoked. And also, if the person files for a PRA and the PRA does not go through, that person's PR card gets revoked. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed this lesson as much as we enjoyed putting it together for you. Remember that this topic is really important in understanding to pass your full skills exam. Remember that this topic, again, plays a role across the whole spectrum of immigration. So by understanding residency requirements as it pertains to permanent resident status, you're hopefully covering yourself for at least part of every single topic you need to study for the full skills exam. Alright, so have a really great day. The sample questions are coming up, so be sure to tune into those. And thanks for tuning in.